writing a book called Prayer Encounters. I reached out to a longtime friend who was an excellent writer and had a very keen eye. And so I tried to tell her what I was trying to do, but I had a hard time articulating it. And she barraged me with questions until I could finally spit something out that started to make sense. It's what I needed. And Sarah had a rocky relationship with God over the years, but not for a lack of effort. She has tried on many faiths in many different faiths in many different colors, but nothing just seemed to fit her. And I asked her what she thought about praying with other people, which was what the book was about, praying with other people. And she said, that's terrifying. It's the most intimate thing that there is. And truer words really were never spoken. Prayer is an intimate thing. A few months later, she called me in a very anxious state, and she said, Paul, can you tell me why some people have much, much harder lives than others? And I told her that I wasn't sure I could answer that question. And I dread that question. There is no good answer to that question, and many try to rationalize it. Well, we all suffer. Life is hard, but you do not have to be a pastor to know that there are most definitely some people who have a harder life than others. It can't always be explained away by saying that people bring it upon themselves, or which is sometimes true, but it's just a hard fact of this world that we live in. She said, you're a pastor. You're supposed to have an answer for this. I wish. And I said, what's going on, Sarah? I already knew that she had lost her parents at a young age, and I knew that she had had more of her share of difficult relationships. I knew that she struggled with anxiety and depression. Within the last week, though, she told me she had had another breakup. And she also found out that she was pregnant. And shortly after that, found out that she had lost the baby. And during the procedure, they discovered cancer. All in a week. It isn't fair. It is not fair at all. There was silence. And then she said, can you pray with me? And don't make this into one of your stories. Editorial note, she later gave me permission to share the story. I knew how difficult it was for her to ask that question. Can we pray? I began to pray. I lifted up her grief and her hurt and her anger. I asked for healing of her body and soul. I asked God to remove her depression and to let her experience joy. And at this point, she cut into my prayer with her own plea. And she said, God, I would be satisfied with just not feeling miserable. You don't even have to make me feel great or joyful or happy. Just take away the misery that I feel every day. I'm fine with okay. Within her voice lay a bare bones, honest expression of pain, of what was in her heart. And it cut right into my heart. And I believe that it cut into the heart of God as well. For God is infinitely more compassionate than I am. I closed the prayer by asking God to reveal himself to her. Sometimes what we really just need to know is that God's there. And that he hears our cries in pain. Communication with God is essential to our spiritual health. Last week we talked about trusting God. This kind of the basic foundation of how we have any kind of relationship is trust. A degree of safety that when we come to God that we can speak and be vulnerable with God. So to have communication with God requires at least some degree of trust to begin with. And as we said last week, Psychiatry, verified by neuroscience, has found that one of the most healing things that can happen for our brain, the part of our brain that allows us to trust and to have relationship, to receive and give love, is to be heard and felt by another. And last week we talked about that on a human level, but this week on a human God level, a human divine. If we knew that we were being heard by God, if we knew that God felt what was in our heart when we spoke to Him, if we were able to hear God back, communication with God is one of the foundational parts of our spiritual health, which I gave you a definition for last week, which is that we are able to read, it's the degree that we're able to receive God's love for us, be transformed by God's love for us, and then to share God's restoring love in our relationships with others by loving them. That's spiritual health. And so what is communication? Well, just think about the word for a moment. It's not just speaking words, right? But communication. Communion is at the heart of it. And what's communion? Communion is a deep sharing and receiving. An offering of self and a receiving of the offering of another. That's what communion is. It's being with one another at a very deep level, where we really bare our souls to one another. And our very first communication as baby is maybe the most effective communication and the most honest communication that we'll ever have. Crying. We cry out. It's so honest. There's no deception. There's no manipulation. There's no nothing. It's just, I need something. It makes me think of my friend Sarah, who really cried out. I just want just to be okay. Crying. And on some levels, to really get to a deep level of prayer with God, or with anybody, we have to learn to cry again. I remember one of my first therapy sessions where I was meeting with a therapist, and I started, and this if you've ever been to therapy or spoken to a pastor, the tears just, they come up because we're being heard in a safe place, and the tears begin to come up, and my tears began to come up, but I did what I had been taught to do, which is to clamp them up, just to kind of stuff them back down, right, and close my mouth, and he stopped me. He said, no, Paul, leave your mouth open. Just let yourself cry. Just think about, look, a toddler cries with their mouth just wide open, and that mouth is kind of a portal to your soul. You're crying out. And so when I look at the story of Hannah that we looked at today, I see what prayer, really authentic communication with God, looks like. Hannah had a tough life. I don't know, we don't know a lot of details, but we know that her marriage was not ideal. Elkanah had another wife, Peninnah, and Peninnah was unbelievably fruitful, having children right and left, and Hannah was not able to have children, or at least had not had children up until that point. Was it because she was being neglected by Elkanah, or was there something about her biology, or what was it? We don't know that. But every year they went to this festival, this high holy day, and they celebrated by, having a big barbecue and then offering a portion to God. And Elkanah, her husband, gave her a double portion of meat. Here you go. You can't have children, but have another steak. Really cold consolation. And she couldn't even eat it. She was sick of hearing from Peninnah about what a failure that she was as well. She had no one to turn to. Her husband dismissed it. Well, aren't I worth 10 sons to you? Listen, Bob. So who does she turn to? She turns to her God. And she goes up to the temple. Everybody else is partying. On a high holy day, nobody in the temple, as far as we know, but the old priest, Eli. And she goes, and she begins to pray. And not her mouth, her lips are moving, right? But no sound. Her voice wasn't heard. It wasn't audible. She was praying in her heart. But because of her emotional state, Eli thought she was a drunken woman and accused her of such. She said, no. She said, no, I am crying out of my great vexation, my anxiety. I'm pouring out my heart to the Lord. She didn't even say what it was. She wanted a son. And Eli told her that may her prayer be granted. So this is what prayer is. It is a pouring out. It is a pouring out of your soul. It is speaking in your heart. It is pleading with God. That's the very basic level. And we do that. We cry out to God. We give thanks. We express joy. Many things to God. But prayer is a two-way street. This communication is two-way. We cry out to God, but does God respond? I think this is part of the thing that's missing in most prayer lives. Is we cry out to God, but is it being heard? And how do we know it's being heard? And would God respond? And how would He respond? Would we even give God a chance to respond? Would we even believe enough to believe that He could speak back to us? Are we looking? Do we have, as Jesus said, do we have ears to hear and eyes to see? So, the second part of our story. She did have a child. And you know what she named that child? Samuel, which means God has heard. Now, Samuel's the answer to her prayer. She knew that God responded. But even before He responded, she knew. She trusted that He did. You remember what she did? She went home with her husband, and she did the thing that needed to be done to have her prayer answered. She knew her husband. So there was already a faith involved. So we have young Samuel. He's not being raised by his father, Elkanah, but by the old priest Eli, who was an utter failure as a father. He spoiled his sons, and therefore they were making a mess of the priesthood. But he had another chance with this young boy, Samuel. And Samuel was hearing this voice in the middle of the night. Well, that's for prophets and people like Samuel were thinking. That's how it was in that day. And so, Samuel, what is it, Eli? No, son, go back to bed. Samuel. And he goes back and forth. And finally, see, it's been a long time since Eli had heard from God. Eli had not been faithful. He wasn't hearing from God. Oh, wait a second. Now I remember. God speaks. And He said, look, go back to bed, and if you hear your name again, it is the Lord calling you. And say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. And so he did just that. And he spent a whole life hearing. And it even says that as he grew and grew, and then he became a judge, the greatest judge in all of Israel's history, he never let a single word from the Lord's mouth fall. He never missed a word from God. He was paying attention so closely to God that he heard every word that God spoke to him. An amazing relationship with God. The prophet Joel said there would be a day when God's Spirit would be poured out on all people. Which is to say that all people will be prophets like Samuel. Which is to say that all people will be able to hear the voice of God. That's what Pentecost is all about. It's not necessarily about speaking, it's about hearing. So, how do we hear from God? Well, it looks differently for different people. But let me just give you an example from my own life. I was having just a rough day. This last year has been rough for a lot of people, for me too. And as I went out and started a company, and it's been tough I've had to trust God on a new level. For income, for what to do, for how to do all these things. Every step of the way, God has been teaching me to trust. But I just felt like lost in this thing. I was driving home from this appointment over off Preston Road in Plano area, and I just was crying out, God, help me, I need help. And it was like God said, all right, pay attention, Paul. And I looked, and I was on Campbell Road. All right, Campbell Road. I have a daughter. My daughter's name is Campbell. All right, that's interesting. All right. And then I turn to the right and I see Nelson's Steakhouse. I'm like, God has given me these children. God was faithful. I prayed for years for children, and God gave me Nelson, and God gave me Campbell. And then you know what I saw? Right between Campbell Road and Nelson's Steakhouse, La Hacienda. Now, that's not obvious, just to say, but that is where my wife and I had our rehearsal dinner for our wedding, at that very La Hacienda. And I remembered that I had blown marriages before I met my wife Jennifer. I was a wreck in terms of relationships. And God gave me Jennifer. God has been so gracious to me. Nelson, Campbell, Jennifer. How could God leave me hanging now? Why would I ever think? And so the trust was restored. The communication was there. That's kind of how it is. The question is how to teach people to pray. And really, the best way I've found, well, let me just give you an example of, I was leading a youth group in my first ministry. And I had this wonderful group of young men and women who I didn't even grow up in church. They met me through playing basketball. And so now we were bringing them in for youth group. And I said, we're going to learn how to pray. We got in a circle, and I'd say, each person step forward, just say what you want to pray for. You want something you want for somebody else, whatever it is. And they were very timid. They barely stepped forward, and I had to really urge some of them to step forward. And finally they did. But I said, now next week, I want you to remember what you prayed. And then I want to start next week by thanking God. I want you to be paying attention to how He answers your prayers. And so we began. And one of our prayers was that a new person would come to the youth group. And I said, do you have any answered prayers? And she said, and one person said, yeah, we got 2 new people here today. And all of a sudden the light went on. God answers prayers. And this became one of the most powerful little prayer groups I'd ever been a part of. 14, 15, 16-year-old kids. Because all of a sudden they realized they could pray and God was hearing. That's how we pray, and that's how we communicate with God. Will we have eyes to see and ears to hear God? Let me finish the story with my friend Sarah. 2 weeks after this prayer, that God would reveal God's self to her, I got a text. It happened. What happened? God showed up. What? How? She started telling me that I might think that she needs to be institutionalized. And she was walking her dog down a wooded path the last evening when all of a sudden, what must have been thousands of fireflies, she said, converged and enveloped her. And a strange occurrence, especially when you consider that it was only March, and she was in Missouri. The fireflies had at least another month before they began to appear in her region. I asked her, why do you believe that was God showing up for you? And she explained that the last time that she had seen a firefly, she was a child at her grandparents' farm. The last time, she says, I truly felt happy. Since that, she says, that wonderful wooded walk with God, whenever she sees fireflies, they remind her that God is there and God cares. That God heard her cry and God communicated back. That's a miracle. Communication with God is nothing short of a miracle. I'm going to give you another homework assignment. I can't make you do these. I'm not grading you on these. There's not going to be a grade at the end of the summer. But whether or not you want to experience a deeper love from God, yourself, and others, whether or not you want to have greater peace, joy, that takes some work on your part. So I urge you. 2 steps. 1, sometime this week, tell God everything you fear or worry about. Tell God everything you hope for. And end by thanking God for everything for which you are thankful. This may take some time. You could pray this throughout the week. By the way, this is at the end of the bulletin, what I'm saying here. And then the second thing, I want you to try to identify 3 instances in the next week in which you believe God was communicating back with you. And if you feel comfortable to do so, email your instances to me, Reverend Paul Burns at gmail.com. I would love to hear these stories. And it's a way that you can then remember them yourself as you write them down. He's out there. God hears you. He hears your cries, even the unspoken ones.